Good morning. We're in the slightly shorter travel season of the year. Much like the summer months, November and December can be kind of hit and miss with our attendance and who's here and what visitors we get. So we're missing a lot of folks. We're glad to have a couple of visitors with us too to even out those numbers a little bit. If you are visiting the area and you're not from Utah, I imagine your eyes have been drawn to the mountains on a number of occasions. Now, come March, I'll have lived in Utah for 7 years. And in all this time, even today, I still stop in my tracks, stop whatever I'm doing at that certain time of day when the sun is setting and the light hits the mountains just right. After 7 years, I still stop and drop everything and just stare at the mountains. Everybody else do that too? I know you do. And that's what makes it so great out here, is looking out your window and seeing the mountains. Mountains are beautiful. They are majestic. They're huge. They are powerful. And they captivate our attention. And they always have. Mountains have served a great purpose as well. Not other than just being beautiful scenery, they've been very useful to mankind throughout the ages as well. Mountains have served as places of refuge over the years. They've given people safety and security. They've been natural borders and boundaries between regions and countries and different peoples, so they serve as protection, obstacles in the way. We enjoy them for recreation as well. I enjoy climbing mountains. Some people who don't really care to maintain the function of their limbs enjoy sliding down them on skis and snowboards. Others enjoy various other winter sports or hiking or camping out there. So for recreation, for purpose, for usefulness, we get the snow that's up there, and we hope we get lots of snow up in the mountains this winter, not just for you snowboarders or skiers, but so that come summer it's not a drought. They're beautiful and they're very useful, and they've even worked their way into our everyday language. We have many idioms and figures of speech related to the mountain. We might say, for example, I have a mountain of work piled on my desk waiting for me on Monday. Or you could say I'm buried under a mountain of debt. Hopefully not, but lots of people in this country do say that. I've been described as being a mountain of a man at times too. So we use these words and phrases to describe everyday things, and it's no wonder in some that mountains and their significance enjoy such a wide familiarity among mankind throughout history. It's no wonder that many of the Bible's greatest and most significant events are centered around a mountain. Think about that. This morning, we're just going to talk about some of the famous mountains in the Bible and how God revealed himself in various ways, and just make observations about some of the characteristics of the mountains before we come around to the end of the lesson and talk about what this means for us as Christians, our spiritual mountain, and make some conclusions and applications there. So firstly, we're just going to begin by talking about some of the characteristics of mountains. And in each of these characteristics, I'm going to show you some examples from the Bible, some Bible mountains. Hopefully you'll recognize a lot of these. Maybe you'll learn something new. You haven't really heard it before. But either way, let's talk about mountains this morning. Mountains have served as a refuge. And certainly when we go to the Old Testament, in Joshua chapter 14, we read about divvying up the promised land, that Joshua and Caleb, if you will, kind of had first dibs because they were the two faithful from that entire generation that got to go into the promised land. The rest of their generation, because they didn't have faith in God, the 10 spies said, we can't do it. Well, God said, you wander around the wilderness till that generation dies off, except Joshua and Caleb. In Joshua 14, Caleb picks a specific place because of its strategic value, because it's hill country. He says, I know they've got fortified cities there, but I know God will help me take care of them. I don't doubt that, even though they're very well defended there. But he says, I want this place because it's hill country. When you've got the high ground, that's very defensible. That's an easily defendable position to be in. That's why when two armies are on the battlefield, there's always a jockeying for position. You always want the high ground because you're in a much better position there. And that's why Caleb wanted that land. In Judges chapter 6, one of the many occasions when The surrounding lands like the Midianites would come in and they would start to, fight and inflict punishment and burn crops and such to the Israelites, and they'd cry out for a judge. It says in Judges 6 and verse 2, they would hide up in caves to escape pressure from their enemies. And of course, God would let these enemies come in because, Israel was not so faithful, and they needed a reminder, a wake-up call. So God would send in a nation to dominate them a little bit, and they'd cry out for deliverance, and God would send them a judge. And even in Matthew 24 and verse 16, Jesus himself, when he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, he tells them in Matthew 24 and verse 16, when you see the signs, the writing on the wall that says Jerusalem's about to be destroyed, he says, run to the mountains. Kind of funny thing to say if it's a worldwide judgment coming. It's kind of funny for him to say, go to the mountains as if you could escape worldwide judgment. But he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he says the mountains is where you'll find some safety. So all throughout history, and even in the Bible, people have turned to mountains seeking refuge. They've been seeking protection. And so some of the more notable Bibles in the Scripture have done just that and served just that purpose. In 1 Kings chapter 19, when you go to that chapter, we'll kind of get the backstory to this a little bit later, a different mountain. We talked to the mountain at Oreb. And this is where, there's other stories about this mountain, but in 1 Kings 19, it served as a refuge for Elijah. He was running for his life because Jezebel really wanted him dead. Jezebel had promised, I will kill Elijah. So he runs for his life, and he finds safety in the mountain of Oreb. That's the place where he got his strength back, where he got encouraged by God. And so in a spiritual sense, we find a place of refuge for Elijah, that he was saying to God in this chapter, God, can you please just end my life now? I'm the only one left. I'm the only prophet that's left. And all of Israel has turned against me and turned against you, and Jezebel wants to kill me, so God, could you just do it for me right now? I'm done. I'm finished. And God says, no, you're not. And stop making such a big deal. You're not the only one left. There are 7,000 good people left in Israel that have not bowed the knee to Baal. There's always a remnant, and there always will be. Yes, you might seem outnumbered right now, Elijah, but you are not alone. There are other faithful, and I've got work for you to do. You need to go find a guy named Elisha and prepare him to take your place. His time was coming to an end, but not yet. He still had more work to do. So in that mountain, Elijah found refuge and safety from Jezebel, and also was encouraged, reinvigorated to go back out and carry on. He was at the point of being ready to give up and just die. And God says, no, you've got more work to do, and I'm going to show you that there are more faithful people out there than you think. There's still a remnant in this country. So Elijah found refuge there. I got them a little bit out of order, but if you go back to Genesis chapter 8 and verse 4, you guys should know this, a little trivia question everybody probably should know. Where did the ark find its resting place after the flood? The mountains of Ararat. And so, again, another example where after the flood came, the waters came through and cleansed the earth. This is the resting place. This is the place of refuge that Noah and his family and all the animals that were on that boat, they found rest in the mountains of Ararat. In John chapter 6, if you turn to John chapter 6 and verse 15, the mountains were a favorite place of Jesus. This is a scripture I read to Jessica anytime I want to go for a hike, and she says, no, you can't go for a hike. I said, well, Jesus liked to go in the mountains, so I want to go in the mountains too. John chapter 6 and verse 15, when Jesus needed a little alone time, a little me time, he would go to the mountains because they're a place of solitude in many respects. Therefore, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, says he withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. And I think that was a favorite place of prayer for Jesus, to go up in the mountains and find some solitude. And so in the Bible, mountains offer a certain refuge, and in a spiritual sense, they do as well. A lot of people have found their courage and have been encouraged by God when they flee to the mountains and they find that security and a brief respite from their problems. And that's something mountains have always offered. Now, another characteristic of mountains is their strength, their immense size, that they do not move. I guess they say that Everest is growing by a quarter inch a year, but that seems, for all intents and purposes, compared to its size at around 29,000 feet in elevation, seems pretty minimal. I'd say it's basically staying put. Mountains are strong, and they possess a great power and strength, which we humans are just powerless against. Think about some of the incredible things that happen on mountains, the storms that take place. We are entirely at the mercy of the mountain when we're there. I mean this in the absolute most amateur, unprofessional sense. I consider myself a little bit of a mountaineer, and I've climbed a few mountains. Again, very, very amateur. But one time I was climbing Mount Hood, and it's frustrating how close you can get to a summit and have the weather say, nope, you got to turn around. I was climbing it. We climbed starting at midnight all through the night, got up to the top, and it's not uncommon in the Cascades for clear blue skies, except right around the summit to have this mass of clouds, this weather system just localized on the summit. We get a couple hundred feet short of the summit, and it's so cloudy, so thick with fog that we can't see from one person to another 5 feet away. And with crevasses all over the snow, we decided it's best to just turn around. This mountain will probably still be here for the rest of our lives. We can try it again another day. Most mountain climbers acknowledge a truth, that you don't conquer a mountain. If the mountain permits you, it gives you a window of time to sneak up to the summit and back, but only if the mountain permits it. We are entirely helpless at the power of a mountain. We see avalanches. Again, what can you do if you're caught in the middle of an avalanche? You do your best to, keep a pocket of air in front of your face, but otherwise you are entirely powerless and helpless against that power. And when a mountain does erupt, I know some of you were alive. Many of you were there to see Mount St. Helens erupt in Washington and how it put a plume of smoke in the atmosphere that basically went all over the world. And we have ancient cities like Pompeii that was destroyed by a volcano, and so they're very powerful. And in the Bible, we see lots of examples where God is associated with the power and strength and immovability of these mountains. At Mount Sinai, the scripture that Cody read for us a few moments ago, it talks about how there was clouds and this darkness and thunder, and it was spewing forth lightning. And God told them, put a barrier around the mountain and tell people, nobody crosses this barrier or they die, because this mountain is holy. And before this, Moses prepared them, and they went through this cleansing process for 3 days because God was going to be there. And it was a sight that was so terrifying to them that they said, Moses, you go there alone. You talk to God. We want to stay here. We're scared. They were terrified. This was God impressing upon them His strength, His power, His magnificence, and it worked. Like it says in Exodus chapter 20, that God was in a sense testing them, reminding them of His strength and power, that they shouldn't forget. Yet 40 days later, Moses lingers on the mountain, and they say, what happened to Moses? I don't know, let's build a God. Let's build our own God, and that seems so foolish to me. This thing which we just created, we're going to say it created us. That's ridiculous. It should have impressed upon them the power and strength of God. Now, we talked about how Elijah, if you turn to 1 Kings chapter 18, we talked about how Elijah fled to Mount Oreb for his life. But let's go back a little ways in 1 Kings chapter 18, and I want you to notice what it was that got Jezebel and Ahab so upset with Elijah. Now, hopefully you know that Ahab and Jezebel were as wicked as they come, as far as the kings of Israel go. They really set the bar at its lowest for evil. And Jezebel was personally supporting hundreds upon hundreds of the priests of the Baals and Asherah. And so it came to a point where one of the righteous remnant was this fellow named Obadiah, who's kind of a go-between Ahab and Elijah. And he said to Obadiah, go tell King Ahab, I want to talk to him and I want to arrange this little meeting here. And so it says in 1 Kings chapter 18, Starting in verse 17, it came about that when Ahab saw Elijah, and Ahab said to him, "Is this you, you troubler of Israel?" It had not rained in Israel for a couple of years. Read about that in James chapter 5, about the power of prayer as well. That's why he refers to him as a troubler of Israel. But he says in verse 18, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed the Baals. Now then, send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of the Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." So they gather them together at Mount Carmel, and he says, "I've got a challenge for you. Let's take 2 oxen, and I'll let you pick first. You pick one of them, put it on the altar, carve it up the way you like, and why don't you call down to Baal and see if he can light this sacrifice on fire." And so from morning to noon, all the way into the evening, they're crying out, getting more and more intense with their cries, calling on Baal to win this challenge, and they start to pierce themselves with swords and lances till blood was pouring out in devotion to their false deity, and nothing. And Elijah starts to mock him a little bit. Maybe he's fallen asleep. Maybe you need to call louder to him. Maybe he can't hear you. Maybe he's gone on a trip, and maybe he's, be back in 15 minutes sign is hanging up outside his door or something. And so finally Elijah says, "Okay, it's my turn. Let's pour this altar, cover it with water, do it a second time. Let's do it a third time till there was even a pool of water around it." Didn't take Elijah from morning to evening calling on God. Took him one try. God, fire came down, consumed it, even lapped up the water, it says, till it was gone. And then Elijah said, let's take these 450 prophets of Baal and let's deal with them. Let's put them to death. And that's why Jezebel said, "I'm coming for you. I'm going to kill Elijah because he killed all these prophets of Baal." But on Mount Carmel, it was another display of God's power and his strength. The fact that he had this great victory over these false priests of the Baal. So on mountains, we find great displays of strength. And at times, God displayed his own strength on mountains. Another characteristic of mountains, this is a bit more on the obvious side, they're really tall. And so throughout time, cultures have associated mountains with a certain nearness to God or nearness to the heavens. Many cultures think of mountains as holy places. And like I said, that's mostly to do with the fact that they reach up into the sky. So the higher you get, the closer you are supposedly to God. And that's why a lot of people view it this way. But in many ways, throughout the Bible, God actually has spoken with people. God has revealed himself on mountains. A couple of examples. Mount Moriah. In Genesis 22, and it's no mistake that there's a parallel here, that in Genesis 22, Abraham was told to take his only son Isaac, take him to land in Moriah on a mountain there, and offer him as a sacrifice. And it's no mistake that parallels God giving his son Jesus, as we sang the song, the hill called Calvary, or Mount Calvary. That there was a place where Jesus, a hill or a mountain, where he was offered, where God offered his son. And so Mount Moriah is where Abraham was called to offer Isaac. Of course, we know the angel stopped him, and he got his son back figuratively. But in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 1, 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 1, in the same place where God revealed himself to Abraham, that's where the temple would be built, the dwelling place of God. 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 1, then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And so Mount Moriah is a place where God revealed himself to Abraham. God revealed himself, and it was a place of worship and sacrifice when David built an altar there, and a generation later Solomon built the temple, which is spoken of as the dwelling of God. So this was a place where God, his presence was felt. Mount Sinai. Again, there's this nearness to God. In Exodus chapter 34, let's go to Exodus chapter 34. Moses had a very unique experience with God on Mount Sinai. Well, all the rest of Israel was terrified to be even near the mountain. Moses had about as close to a face-to-face encounter with God as there is or ever was. In Exodus 34, starting in verse 29, it came about when Moses was coming down from Mount Sinai, and the 2 tablets of testimony were in Moses' hand as he was coming down from the mountain. Then Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because of his speaking with him. So when Aaron and all the sons of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. Then Moses called them, and Aaron and all the rulers in the congregation returned to him, and Moses spoke to them. And afterward the sons of Israel came near, and he commanded them to do everything that the Lord had spoken to him on Mount Sinai. And he puts a veil over his face because he shone so brightly. The radiance of God's glory was still radiating off of his own skin and his own face. That's as close as it gets to seeing God face to face. And it was there on Mount Sinai. In Matthew chapter 17, we know the story, the transfiguration. Again, Jesus took, this time, Peter, James, and John to the top of a mountain. And it says he was transfigured before them. And much like Moses, I think he shone brightly. And there were 2 other men, Moses and Elijah, both veterans of the mountain, if you will. We've already talked about some of their mountain stories, and sometimes I don't think we give enough attention to Elijah. You know, Moses was there, and we understand that. He was the great prophet, but why was Elijah there? That must mean he was someone pretty special. Maybe we should give a little more attention to Elijah, but he was there at the transfiguration, and God spoke down from heaven, said, "This is my son, you should listen to him." Another time where God revealed himself in a very powerful way on a mountain. And finally, one more observation about mountains and their characteristics is that you gain a certain perspective, a certain clarity from the summit of a mountain. Sometimes it's a good strategy if you're lost. If you've been out camping or out hunting and you're lost and can't find your way, if you're near a hill or a mountain, a small mountain, sometimes it's a good strategy to get up to enough high ground where you can see everything a little bit better. Because the perspective from the top of a mountain, and a couple years ago, Randy and I camped up at top, you know that weather station on Francis Peak? Right there, we went drive all the way up there, and we camped up there, and it was neat to just stand on top and see a 360-degree view out in the Cache Valley on the other side, and see almost as far as Logan and Park City, and see Salt Lake City, and I could kind of see some of the landmarks and say, well, that follow this road, and that's the high school, and so that must be my house somewhere in that little cluster right there. And you could really see everything from a mountain. And so mountains in the Bible have been associated with clarity, with revealing of information, revealing of God's will. And of course, most notably is Mount Sinai again. Very important mountain, and a lot of things happened there. God displayed his power. God visited Moses there, but we associate Mount Sinai, we even sometimes call it the covenant of Sinai, because that's where the law was revealed, starting in Exodus chapter 19. In Exodus chapter 20, we have the 10 Commandments, and the next dozen or more chapters is the law that governed Israel, and the exact specifications of the tabernacle. And so God revealed his will on Mount Sinai, and they entered into this covenant there. We have Mount Nebo. Deuteronomy chapter 34. Moses is 120 years old. He's still pretty vigorous for that age, and says he still has very sharp eyes like an eagle. But he was not to enter into the promised land. But God took him up so that he could see, so that he could have a vision out into the promised land of Canaan. And so again, another example where a mountain in the Bible is associated with vision and seeing and revelation, things being revealed, as the promised land was revealed from the mountaintop to Moses. And in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 1, we have the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. It doesn't specify which mountain this is. A lot of people have speculations, but it doesn't really matter. We know that Jesus was fond of teaching. Sometimes when it says mountain, it might just mean, a little bit of a hill, but the idea is the same, that God wanted his voice to be heard, so he spoke from a point of elevation where people could gather around and see. And that's why I'm standing up here on the podium, so I can be heard a little bit better. And so this was Jesus' favorite podium, was the side of a mountain, where he could be heard, where he could be seen, and lots of people could gather around. Wasn't a bad seat in the house. And starting in Matthew chapter 24 and 25, we have Jesus speaking on the Mount of Olives, or Olivet, as we say sometimes. And there again in Matthew 24, he's revealing about a coming judgment on the city of Jerusalem, as well as maybe in chapter 25, some parables about the talents and about the final judgment. The sheep will be separated on the right for all their good deeds, and the wicked for all their negligence, and wicked deeds will be parted as goats on the left. And all this great teaching came from the Mount of Olives. And in Acts chapter 1 and verse 12, it's likely the same place where Jesus is taken back up, where he sits on a throne in heaven now. So a lot of teaching, a lot of revelation, a lot of clarity and perspective comes from mountains. So there's one more mountain I want to talk about this morning. That's on Mount Zion. This is something we sing about often, but maybe something we're not all too clear about. What is Zion? What is Mount Zion? What do we mean when we talk about it? Specifically, it can mean the little hill that the temple is built on. But more generically, it often refers to, not Mount Zion, but Zion references Jerusalem as a whole. The temple and the city, everything in the walls. A lot of times in the Old Testament, when we talk about Zion, we're really just referring to Jerusalem, maybe a little more specifically the temple at times, but it's where God dwells. And that's why it's spoken of as Mount Zion, the holy dwelling of God. And we can look at a few examples in the Old Testament. Psalm 87, if you will. Psalm 87, starting in verse 2. It says, "The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the other dwelling places of Jacob. Glorious things are spoken of you, O city of God." And so in a very physical sense, it's talking about the city of Jerusalem, and maybe at times emphasizing the temple, because that's where God is said to dwell. Psalm 132. Psalm 132 is another reference that might clarify things a little bit. Psalm 132, verse 13. "For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his habitation. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it." Again, it's referencing Jerusalem, but specifically the fact that God dwells there. So in Old Testament references, it means Jerusalem in a physical sense, but in prophecy, it represents the new spiritual Jerusalem and this spiritual mountain. I want to share with you a couple of prophecies. They're here below on the screen, starting in Daniel chapter 2. Prophecies that we should all be familiar with, but maybe we don't notice some of the details regarding the mountains here. Now in Daniel chapter 2, we know that contextually, this is where Daniel interprets the king's dream, and in this dream the king sees a statue made of a head of gold, and arms and chest of silver and bronze, and clay and iron for the feet. And so it's made up of 4 sections, and Daniel tells him, your dream represents 4 successive kingdoms. He says, you Babylonians, you represent the head. The next comes the Persians historically, the Greeks and the Romans. And he says in Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 34, Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 34, interpreting this dream, he says that the stone, this large stone cut from the mountains, not done by man, this is something God does, not cut out by human hands, comes down and destroys, reduces the statue to rubble. So in Daniel chapter 2, verse 35, or rather verse 34, but at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason, wrong chapter. Chapter 2, verse 34. You continued looking until the stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay, and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed, all at the same time, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and wind carried them away, so that not a trace was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. A prophecy about God building this mountain that would encompass all kingdoms. And we read a little bit later on in this same chapter, verse 44. And in the days of those kings, that is, the feet, which represents the Roman Empire, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put to end all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. And so he's telling us that God would build this kingdom, and it would be like this great mountain. It would encompass all the world. And in Isaiah chapter 2, if we go back a little ways in our Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 2, another reference to this mountain that God would build and establish. Isaiah 2, verse 2, now it will come about that in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. Again, that idea that this mountain covers the whole world. Everybody's welcome. It's not just one nation. It's not just Israel anymore. We're all part of this great mountain, this mountain of the house of God. And many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And when we go to the New Testament, we connect these dots in Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 22, regarding this great mountain of prophecy. It's the church. It's the kingdom that Jesus built and purchased with his blood. That's what we're talking about. But you have come to Mount Zion, and the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of righteous men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, which speaks better than the blood of Abel. That's what all this means. This Mount Zion we have come to is the new Jerusalem, the spiritual Jerusalem, and it's the church. He said right there in Hebrews chapter 12. So what this means to me is that God promised, back in the days of Isaiah and Daniel, hundreds of years before Jesus came, God promised to build this great mountain, and it would be his kingdom and his church. And that tells me that the church, of which we are a part of today, that belongs to Christ, it has these same characteristics of mountains. The church today is a refuge. As the mountain of God, it is our refuge place. It's our place of safety and security. Jesus said in Matthew 11 and verse 28, come all to me who are weary and heavy laden. I'll give you rest. My burden is easy, my yoke is light. It says, come to me and I can lighten your load. You can find rest with me. And Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 18 talks about us as people seeking refuge. And so we find refuge in this kingdom, this mountain of God today. And isn't this wonderful? I don't know how stressful your week has been, but I don't know how stressful your coming up week is going to be. Art's rolling his eyes at me right now. But today, being with you, this is my refuge. This is our refuge here. This is our brief respite, like Elijah on Mount Carmel. Mount Horeb. When he found that brief pause, that respite from his problems, and was encouraged, he wanted to give up and die, but God said, no, you've got more work to do. There's still a faithful remnant. Now go out and keep working. This is our refuge. Isn't that wonderful? Mountains are a source of strength, and so is church. And God is our source of strength today. We studied in Romans chapter 8. The first two verses say, there is now, therefore, no condemnation for those who are in Jesus Christ. Sin is not master over us. We are not slaves to sin anymore. We are slaves of God unto righteousness. We have that power. And Romans chapter 8 ends with that encouragement that neither height nor depth nor rulers nor whatever, you name it, nothing can separate us from the love of God, because we have strength in him. 1 Peter chapter 5. I love this chapter here. 1 Peter chapter 5. I'm going to start in verse 6. What about our enemy? In this mountain, in this church, we find strength through God to face our enemies. In 1 Peter chapter 5, the devil is spoken of as a roaring lion who's looking to devour us. But it says in verse 6, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety upon him because he cares for you. Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary the devil prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren who are in the world. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. We find strength to face our enemies and our adversary, the devil, in this mountain of God. We are near to God. We know this is the body of Christ. And so we are near to God. We are spoken of as the temple of the Lord, the dwelling place of God. And that's what the church is today. Go back to Hebrews chapter 10 for a moment. Hebrews chapter 10. I'm going to read verse 19. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19. Since therefore, brethren, we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus. Again, this illustration of the temple, where God dwelled. Only the priests would go into the temple, into the holy place. It says, we have confidence to enter now by a new and living way which he inaugurated for us through the veil, that is, his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near. God is telling us, he's commanding us, draw near to me. Don't stand so far off. Don't be like the Israelites who kept their distance at Sinai and said, we're afraid, we're staying away. God says, come to me. Draw near with a sincere heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. And then finally, characteristic of mountains, they provide clarity, and that's what we have here. I want to finish with Acts chapter 26, verse 18. Acts chapter 26 and verse 18, Paul is summing up his mission. What Jesus told him to do and what Jesus commanded him and sent him out in the world to do, he sums up in Acts chapter 26 and verse 18. This is what Jesus said to Saul of Tarsus as he sent him out and he became Paul the apostle. His mission was to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light, from the dominion of Satan to God, in order that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in God. Our eyes are opened. We go from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. And we have the greatest perspective. I was sitting at a coffee shop the other day and heard some people trying to figure life out. I wanted to talk to them, but they left before I was finished doing what I was doing. But, it just made me happy. I don't understand everything in the world, but I understand why things are the way they are, because God has showed me. I'm thankful that I don't have to struggle with what is this all about. Because in this mountain, in the kingdom of God, in his church, we have clarity. We have the word revealed to us. As Jude said in verse 3, we have the faith once for all delivered to us. All things pertaining to life and godliness. And I'm thankful for that, for the clarity that comes with pursuing God on his mountain. One final word of caution. Choose your steps carefully. When you're on a mountain, each step matters. This might give new meaning to Matthew chapter 7. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction. There are many who enter through it, for the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. If you're afraid of heights, don't look at the screen right now. In mountaineering, you got to be careful and watch your steps. So my advice to you and my invitation to you this morning is stay on the trail, follow your guide, and that's Jesus. This is a great mountain. We find refuge from the world. We find strength and safety from our enemies. We are near to God. And we have clarity that we got to follow his steps. If there's any way we can help you get in touch with God, we invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing.